The Center for the Improvement of Human Functioning International presents this luncheon lecture. Today's topic, trans fats, and you thought lard was bad. Your presenter, Rebecca Kirby, MD, MS, RD.
Well, welcome everyone to the center. It's great to see you all here. We got you all in the front row. It's just not like church anymore, is it? Well, we're going to talk today about trans fats. And you thought lard was bad. What's all the excitement about? Well, we're first going to talk about why all of a sudden trans fats are in the news. And then we're going to talk a little bit about why we need fats. And because I'm a biochemist, I'm going to make you understand all the different kinds of fats. And, you know, we are basically chemistry. So we're going to review a little bit of fat chemistry. And then we're going to talk about what's so unique about these trans fats and what's happening health-wise. What's all the research that's been accumulated that has driven the FDA to make a famous ruling here. Then we're going to talk a little bit about where these trans fats are and, of course, how to avoid them. So, one of the things that I got to thinking about was the Kansas weather. And that is, it's so unpredictable. You know, I thought, well, is it going to be rainy today? Is it going to be sunny? And I thought it was going to turn out sunny, but you never know. But, you know, it sort of mimics the unpredictability of the FDA. I thought, how many of you guys were told to quit eating butter and start eating margarine for your health? Okay, yes, all right. Well, that was the message. So, there's a different message now, and it's all due to an FDA ruling about labeling trans fats. So that's what we're going to talk about. Well, what's the big deal? Once they started really digesting the evidence, weighing in on the facts, this is why we have the little scales here today, there was a preponderance of evidence about the risk of eating trans fats and heart disease. Well, and the reason they're focusing on heart disease is because heart disease is our #1 killer in the United States. The National Institutes of Health report that 12.5 million Americans will have coronary heart disease, which we call CHD for short, and 500,000 will die of it each year. And what the evidence was finding is the consumption of these trans fats raises your LDL cholesterol, lowers the HDL cholesterol, and therefore increases the risk of heart disease. And the punchline is this combined effect is double that of eating saturated fats and increasing your risk of heart disease. So you traded your butter for the margarine and you doubled your risk for heart disease. So, what happened on January 1st, 2006, this year, the FDA is now requiring food manufacturers to provide information on the amount of trans fats in their products. So this, again, gets us busy reading labels to figure out what's going on in prepared foods. Now, I just want to mention a little caveat here. Trans fats do not have to be listed if there's a low total fat amount of fat in the food, if it's less than 0.5 grams per serving, or if there's not any claims made about the fat or fatty acids in the foods. So you still have to read the back list of ingredients. If it says no trans fats on the front, there still may be some partially hydrogenated foods or components in that food, and we'll digest more of that later. Now, trans fats, the really bad fat. I did a lecture back that was about good, bad, and really bad fats. Well, trans fat's the really bad guy. Unless you think that the scientists were asleep at the wheel. In 1994, there was a very good evidence-based report put out by some scientists that estimated that the consumption of trans fats, trans fatty acids, caused 30,000 premature deaths from heart disease annually in the U.S. And they, in a broader recommendation, they felt like that was an underestimate, that it might be more like 100,000 of premature deaths due to consumption of trans fatty acids. That was 1994. Okay, the opposite side of the debate was the food manufacturers, and their review said, no, you know, this is a lot of tempest in a storm, teapot, not enough good evidence, further research was needed. Okay, well, 10 years later, they had enough, and the FDA said, okay, we've got to do something about it. Well, we've been told for quite a while about eating a low-fat diet, and that's been the nutrition message, not just staying away from the saturated fats, trading in our butter, but it's also been about lowering the fat in our diet. But what we kind of forget sometimes that we need fat. Fat has essential functions, so I just kind of helped review some of the things that fat does. Obviously, it's a big part of our energy because it has so many more calories per gram. It has 9 calories per gram, and carbohydrates and proteins just have 4 calories per gram, so it's a big energy molecule. You need it for growth and cell division. Actually, fatty acids were declared essential, meaning you have to get them in the diet. A couple of ones, one omega-6 and one omega-3 fatty acid, were declared essential because they observed that children did not develop normally unless they had these fatty acids. So fats are important for growth and development, and we've learned about some of the really long-chain fatty acids, that DHA, that's one of those omega-3s, very important for brain development. So fat's necessary. Oxygen transport, necessary for that. Also for hormone production. Where do all our hormones come from? We make them from cholesterol. So that's one of those fats. We need them for hormone production. We also need them to absorb our fat-soluble vitamins. I mean, we have some vitamins that are water-soluble, but we have those that are fat-soluble, the A, D, E, K, and some of our plant carotenoids, some of those pigments are absorbed with fats. So, the kind of fat we eat will determine the fatty acids that make up our cells and our cell membranes. So you really are what you eat. Now, the point is, and again, our scale motif, all fats are not created equal. The role of saturated fat in heart disease was studied for years, but they didn't take into account trans fats. It was just sort of a black and white picture. It was the saturated fats and the unsaturated fats. So now the research is looking back at the trans fats in the diets, and it's also going forward with actually feeding people trans fats versus unsaturated versus saturated fats, and looking at the role. Now, the interesting thing about the polyunsaturated fats is it has a very strong risk reduction for coronary heart disease. And if you took a diet that was a fairly high-fat diet and you substituted the fat in there with a polyunsaturated or a monounsaturated fat, you would have the same kind of risk reduction as reducing the total amount of fat. So you know, like for instance, if you were eating a 50% your calories from fat and they were all the good polyunsaturated, monounsaturated, it might be equivalent to like eating a 30% diet with fat. So it's the kind of fat. That's what it boils down to. It's the quality versus the quantity. So that's why we're talking about the unequal nature of regarding fat just all lumped together. It's the quality much more than the quantity of fat. Okay, so why are fats so unique? Well, they have to be processed differently from our body. Our body has to make these special little absorption micron little packages, so to speak, to help us absorb fats. And we eat different kinds of fat. The main fats we eat are fatty acids, and their molecular structure is something we call triglycerides. That just tells us about the different shapes. But we also eat phospholipids. There's our lecithin. You may think of choline or inositol. Then sterols, the cholesterol, we eat that. The cholesterol is only in animal foods. So when you see jelly beans labeled no cholesterol, just remember that there wasn't any in there in the first place. It's only from animal foods. And we also eat phytosterols. That's another fat, but those are the cholesterol equivalent to plants, in plants. And you may be familiar with beta-sitosterol. That's a plant sterol. And I did a lecture on plant sterols a while back if you're interested in more information about that, because now they add them to foods to help our body not absorb our animal cholesterol. So those are what we actually eat, all those different kinds of fats. And the fats, like I said, that we predominantly eat are made up of fatty acids, and we name them according to length, the number of carbons they have in them, and the position of double bonds. And the number of carbons can be like 18. That's a relatively short one. And then you have your long ones that are like your omega-3s that will be 20 to 22. Doesn't seem like a big difference, but it is to the body. And these are just these long chains of carbon atoms with hydrogens and occasionally double bonds. And so this is how we describe our fats, by our fatty acids. So we'll call them saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and the degree of unsaturated depends on the number of double bonds between carbons. And so if you only have one double bond, you're monounsaturated. And what's our favorite, often wonderful culinary oil that's a monounsaturated that we use a lot? It's very healthy. And the Mediterraneans, yeah, olive oil. Got a lot of good press when the Mediterranean diet shows how healthy those folks are. So if you get more double bonds, you become more unsaturated. So more than one double bond means poly, as in many. And the polyunsaturates you are maybe more familiar with are like our omega-3 fatty acids, where they put, and those are labeled because they put the first double bond on the third carbon. And then omega-3 fatty acid has the first double bond on the sixth carbon. So that's where they get those names. When you see on your label omega-3, omega-6 fatty acids, they're talking about where the label on the double bond is. And the monos, the first double bond is on the ninth carbon, and so sometimes you'll see on your label, your fatty acid supplement may say omega-3, omega-6, omega-9. Well, the omega-9s are just the monounsaturates that are in there. Okay, and then this little line at the bottom, double bonds are in the cis formation. Now store that. The opposite of cis is trans. So remember, natural double bonds are in the cis formation. Okay, so something that's saturated doesn't have any double bonds because it's saturated with hydrogens. And the important property here is that saturation makes an oil solid at room temperature. So that's what happened with the manufacturing process to get trans fats. Food manufacturers were looking for a more stable fat that was solid at room temperature. So the more saturated, the more solid. And the trans fatty acids, like I said, were produced commercially to harden those vegetable oils for our shortening and that margarine. Okay, when good oils go bad. This is the process. Liquid vegetable oils are heated in the presence of a metal catalyst with hydrogen. And this process is called hydrogenation or partial hydrogenation. And I bolded that because that's what you're going to be looking for on the actual ingredients label. Because once again, the food manufacturers will be, a lot of them will be saying no trans fats on the label. But there may be some foods that don't make those claims, and there may be other foods that have a little bit of the partially hydrogenated fats. So you want to flip over your big label, as you call it, the one that splashes the brand name and all, and flip over to the back to look at the food label and the list of ingredients. The list of ingredients is your friend. You know, you have to bring your magnifying glass to the grocery store, but, and there you are, stealthing the list of ingredients with your magnifying glass, taking hours at the grocery store to get your shopping done. But you're looking for the words hydrogenated oils or partially hydrogenated oils. And they'll say vegetable oils, partially hydrogenated or hydrogenated vegetable oils. Okay, so this process caused the oils to be solid at room temperature. So you took an oil and it turned into a solid shortening. And the other thing is it promotes shelf life. This is a more stable product. And when you're talking about the shelf life of oils, you're talking about something that doesn't go rancid as fast or become oxidized as fast. And this is very important in oils because the more polyunsaturated an oil is, all those double bonds, the more unstable it is, it goes rancid fast. So, you know, food manufacturers didn't want their little cupcakes and stuff to be going bad fast. So this was very helpful for promoting shelf life of all the baked goods. Now, the other thing that this property of hydrogenation does is it allows a higher fry temperature. Your fast food folks are able to fry at higher temperatures because these hydrogenated fats are more stable at high temperatures. You know those unsaturated fats, when you've tried to fry with them, how you might start getting smoke right away? Well, that's what we call a low smoke point. It doesn't take much temperature to start changing the oil. The other interesting thing is you can actually be frying in a nice vegetable oil, and a high temperature will actually flip your double bond that remember goes from cis to trans, and I'll show you a little bit more about that. The shape shifting. So your trans fatty acids contain this double bond with two hydrogens, but they're not in that nice cis, which means on the same side of the molecule of the long chain. They're on the trans, the opposite side. Okay, so what the heck does all that mean? Okay, trans, opposite side of the bond of the carbon chain, makes it a stiff molecule. Stiff. Okay, well that was great because it made it solid at room temperature. You know, so you had something that could stay on the shelf forever. It was more stable, but for our purposes, for biological purposes, this stiffness was not necessarily a good thing. Because we are what we eat, when we ingest these trans fatty acids, they're incorporated into our membranes. Our membranes now are stiffer because they don't have the flexibility of this nice cis structure of the normal unsaturated fatty acids. So what we had was a change in our structure of our fatty acids, packing in more tightly and making a more rigid cell membrane. And a picture says 1,000 words. So oleic acid here is actually the most common fatty acid that we consume. And it's an 18 carbon. And these little red dots, or maroon, represent carbon atoms. And it looks like Mickey Mouse, but it's not. And these little gray things are their hydrogens. So, and this over here is oxygen. Okay, but this is a chain, just a chain of carbon molecules with its little hydrogens. And this is a natural oleic acid, like you get in your olive oil. And here is the cis formation, because the little hydrogens around the double bond are on the same side. Okay, and it has this little kink in it. Kink, flexible. Think of that. Okay, and then right here, what happened? Okay, hydrogenation took place, and the hydrogens got put on trans, opposite, and it straightened up the molecule. Okay, so now it's stiff, and it just sort of wreaked havoc. And we've been observing this for quite a while. So this is what we've done. We've changed the structure of our flexible oils. We've made them solid. That seemed like a good idea at the time because it was, you know, good for making nice baked goods. They have a much better crumb structure if you've ever baked with oil. If you've ever taken a recipe that says shortening and substituted exactly the same amount of fat for oil, you didn't get the same product. You will have noticed it's much denser. So there was a lot of benefit to the food manufacturers. Okay, so evidence was piling up about what was going on with all the trans fats in our diet. And some of the first studies that are usually done are epidemiological, where you go back and you look what happened in the past, what people were eating, what diseases they ended up with. And there were, you know, the famous Framingham study that followed a group of people up in the Northeast for a long time. They found that the consumption of margarine was associated with the risk of heart attack or acute MI. But studies from other countries were coming in with the same evidence. Consumption of margarine was a higher risk of heart attack. Italy and Greece were a couple of them. Then they looked at the nurses that they'd been following in this nurses' health study. A lot of data is coming in from that. And they found that the nurses that were taking in the highest amount of trans fatty acids in their diet had the highest risk of heart attack. So it was reaffirming the other studies. And most of their trans fats were coming from margarine, cookies, and white bread. So for these ladies, this was where they were getting most of their trans fatty acids. Well, what is it that's increasing the risk for heart disease with trans fats? Well, the thing that they've centered on most is how it's changing your lipid profile or your fat profile in your blood. And that is, it can increase the LDL cholesterol. Now, the LDL cholesterol is the bad cholesterol. And the way I remember it is L for lethal. And that's the bad guy. You don't want that number high. But you want the next number high. You want your HDLs, which are the H, healthy cholesterol component. You want those high. The higher the better. So the unique thing about the trans fats was not only did they increase the LDL cholesterol, they decreased the HDL cholesterol. Now, diet high in saturated fat will increase your LDL cholesterol, but it will not affect your HDL. So all of a sudden, this was a double whammy. The bad one was going up now, and with the trans, the good one was going down. So the net effect is that when you have a ratio, which is what your risk of heart disease is calculated from, is a risk of total cholesterol and HDL or LDL and HDL, the ratios went up. You don't want a high ratio because that means your denominator, your HDL, your good cholesterol, is low. So with all the HDL going down with the trans fats, all those ratios were going up, and the net effect was an increased risk for heart disease. Now, the other thing it did was it increased the lipoprotein A. Now, this is another lipid fat in the blood that we're just kind of learning about, how it may be a risk factor for heart disease. We're still studying it, but it raised that too. And triglycerides, which ordinarily are not affected that much by the fat in our diet, even had a little bit of increase. So there wasn't any kind of good news from trans fats in the way it affects the lipid profile. So all the research was coming in. These represent, all these little dots on here, or represent studies where researchers actually fed people trans fats diets versus polyunsaturated diets versus monounsaturated. And the preponderance of the evidence showed that, and you can just kind of sum it up by the line that goes up, the more fat in their diet, the more likely their ratio was to go up of their LDL over HDL. And when the ratio goes up, this is like the ratio right there, when that ratio goes up, that's puts you at higher risk for heart disease. And the little round dots were all the trans fats results. And then the saturated fat was also increasing the ratio some, but at a much lower level. The amount of increase in that ratio was much more with the trans, and that was really bad news. Now, one of the other studies that I thought was really interesting was one where they fed them a really low-fat diet. It was 9% of fat, and one group got essentially the partially hydrogenated soybean oil margarine. And then the other group got a saturated fat, which was palm kernel oil. And palm kernel is one of nature's vegetable fats that actually is pretty solid at room temperature. It's very saturated. And they had like a third increased risk for poor dilation of the coronary arteries. Now, you don't want your coronary arteries to be unflexible. And they also had a 50% increase in the ratio here. So just changing from a trans fat from a saturated fat made a difference. And we know how important polyunsaturated fats is, so the contrast between eating trans fats versus polyunsaturates is even bigger. So what else does the trans fats do that's not good for us? Well, it can affect platelet activity, and we don't want our platelets to stick together and cause clots that clog our coronaries or our carotids. And also, it actually may offset some of the benefits you get from eating polyunsaturated oils. So you're doing a good job eating, some polyunsaturates in your diet, but if you have enough trans fats, you may be negating some of your benefit. And also with the trans fats, you're going to get LDL oxidation and all these things, coagulation and fibrolytic factors. That all has to do with the patching that's going on on injured blood vessels. That's the plaque formation, including incorporated these trans fats into endothelial cell membranes, which again is part of that plaque formation. Okay, so that's all, what was happening with the lipids. But frankly, the fat hit the fan, as far as I'm concerned, when you look at what trans fats do with inflammation. Because remember, now we understand a lot more about heart disease, and it's actually our biggest risk factor is inflammation. So we don't have the trans fats just messing with our lipids. We've got it messing with our inflammatory markers. And remember, like I said, inflammation is a risk for heart disease, it's a risk for diabetes, a risk for dyslipidemia, which means just your lipids are bad. It's a risk for insulin resistance, and some of the lectures I researched for dementia, inflammation is a risk for that as well. So, intake of trans fats was studied with inflammation markers. They did a really good job again with those nurses. In the Nurses' Health Study, they gathered up about 800 of them that were pretty healthy, and did a food frequency questionnaire to see what they ate, and measured some inflammatory markers. One of them is tumor necrosis factor, interleukin-6, and the CRP, which is the C-reactive protein. That's something that we measure here as well. Okay, so what they found was the ladies that had the higher trans fats in their diet, the higher amount of trans fats in their diet, they had more activation of the tumor necrosis factor. Now, tumor necrosis factor is one of those inflammatory components that some of those high designer arthritis drugs try to inhibit. So it's a very important marker for inflammation. And when it's activated, it increases lipid oxidation and it affects macrophage and plaque stability, which again is atherosclerosis. But we know also about how much it affects other kinds of inflammation, and I just named arthritis as one of them. So the ladies that were eating more trans fats had more of the tumor necrosis factor. When it came to looking at the other inflammatory markers, like the interleukin, the IL-6, and then the C-reactive protein, they found a correlation with women who were eating more trans fats but had a higher body mass index. So that was the correlation they found there. Still more inflammatory factors. Now, this third point is something that is a little disturbing, because what's the thing that helps us fight inflammation in our bodies with these fatty acids? It's those wonderful omega-3 fatty acids. And we actually can convert some of our fatty acids in our body to the omega-3 fatty acids. They're a long-chain fatty acid. But guess what? Trans fats can actually inhibit some of the conversion to these beneficial omega-3 anti-inflammatory fatty acids. So not only do you have it raising your inflammatory markers, but it's actually disturbing some of the benefit from the omega-3 fatty acids that are fighting inflammation, because it's inhibiting your ability to make some of the conversions. I mean, we can take fatty acids, but our body does make some conversions, and we'd sure like to help it along. So that was a multiple whammy there. Now, okay, 70% fat head. I'm talking about our brains, and we really are a bunch of fat heads. If you dried up the brain, half of it would be the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA. And they estimate that we're about, considering other fats, about 60 to 70% fat up here. And it's also, you think about all those fatty acids I told you they're important for brain development, like the DHA. Okay, so you're eating trans fats, and what happens? It gets incorporated into the brain cell membranes. Remember, it's stiff, not flexible. And also we have fatty acids around all our nerves in the myelin sheath. Okay, so now we've got stiff ones. And what happens? Your brain cells are having problems with communication. They're having to fight the stiff membranes versus the fluid membranes. Brain cells need flexibility and fluidity to function well. So we're just beginning to study more and more the effect of fatty acids on the brain. But I think it is important to remember that when we eat trans fats, they're going to be also incorporated into the membranes for our brain cell membranes. So what happens is our trans fats can replace that very important omega-3 DHA, which is important for brain development and good brain health. And that affects the electrical activity of the neurons, and therefore the communication. And this lovely quote, by modifying natural fats, we have altered the basic building blocks of the human brain, weakening the brain's architecture. And I thought at the beginning of hurricane season, this was a good analogy. Like unstable buildings that come apart in an earthquake or storm or hurricane, poorly structured human brains are failing to cope with the mounting stress of modern life. So that's food for thought. I can't remember the lovely person I got this quote from, but I credit them, whoever that was. That was not mine. Now, I love Julia Childs. She was a great spokesperson for cooking. And she really bemoaned when they made that transition from frying her lovely French fries at fast food joints from lard to vegetable oil. And I don't know if you all remember, she was fairly public about it, and everybody was just like outraged that she would think lard was better. Well, she was right. In 1990, the fast food industry made that conversion of frying in that beef fat lard to the hydrogenated vegetable oils, which were the solid oils. And that was probably because in 1993, the FDA required that saturated fat and cholesterol be on labels. So we were kind of making that shift. It's been that long since you've had the saturated fat and cholesterol on your labels, but the food industry was up there early on. And deep fat frying leads to oxidation of your polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are then incorporated in your plasma fatty acids. And then the risk factor that I mentioned before, that high temperatures can also convert your nice little cis fatty acid to a trans fatty acid at high frying temperatures. And then the effect of these fatty acids, it's cumulative over the years. So all those years we've been eating trans fats, we've been incorporating into our membranes more and more. So what's our risks? 1 unit change in your total cholesterol over HDL ratio. Now remember, ratio is your risk for heart disease because you want a high HDL. A high HDL will be a low ratio. Low is good. So if you have 1 unit increase, that's associated with a 53% increase in your risk for heart disease. Okay, now also, it would require a 10% reduction of saturated fat in your diet to equal the benefit of eliminating trans fats in your diet. So that's kind of like saying you can eat 10% more fat in your diet as long as it's the good stuff and you're not eating trans fats. And then this is a take-home message. As little as 5 grams of trans fat a day raises the risk of heart disease by 25%. So that's why our government got mobilized about food labeling. And I tell you, the food manufacturers are smart. They got mobilized before this, and they're looking for substitutes so that they can offer a product that doesn't have the trans fats and partially hydrogenated fats in it. And actually, the amount of trans fats we've been eating has ranged, according to how they've calculated the data, from 2.6 to 12.8 grams a day. So that's how much we've been consuming. And remember that 5 grams is kind of the cutoff for, increasing our risk factors. And then in the 1960s, when we really got into the margarine and, getting rid of the butter and all the other, lard, our consumption of the trans fats went up. We were eating also more of these commercially produced baked goods and fast foods. We seem to really love those. And we do have some trans fats in nature. Ruminant animals, i.e. those with many stomachs, who have all this fermentation going on, to digest all that wonderful grass they're eating, they create a little bit of natural trans fats. So you can get it in beef and dairy fat. Okay, so this is what we've been doing. Basically, actually, it shifted some. Used to be our principal source of the trans fats was from margarine, and now it's more from the fast foods and our baked stuff. There's the cakes, the cookies, the crackers, the pies, the bread, and you think bread. But if you look on your label, used to, they're working on it, it would, about the third ingredient would be partially hydrogenated vegetable oil. And of course we saw vegetable oil and we thought, oh, well, that's okay. But that was our trans fats. And so we're still getting it from margarine, but I don't know if y'all remember, there was a shift in the way margarine was packaged quite a while back. You didn't have so many sticks offered. You had tubs offered. Well, that's because we knew the more liquid your margarine, the healthier it was. So we've been kind of getting away from the really hardened margarines for quite a while. They gave fried potatoes their own category. And then there's chips and all that stuff. Okay, a little your household shortening, salad dressings, breakfast cereal, and candy. And then actual animal products. Now, if you want to get a little bit of an idea, you might look on the sheet. This is the nice color thing in black and white. I have a version right here, but it also has a little list from our software that's called the NutriCircles. And if you rank order the trans fats in foods, French fries come up there at the top. And actually, it's not just this particular fast food maker. all of them are just as bad. They'll have up to 7 grams of trans fat. Remember, 5 grams increased our risk substantially. And then you have shortenings that are industrial shortenings. You have you see the third one is oil, soybean oil. That's partially hydrogenated soybean oil that they use in industrial baking. Then you have your margarines. And evidently one food manufacturer had a lot of data on this, so that a lot of their cereals came up. And you'll notice beef. If you have a 20% patty, and this is by serving, so that'd be 3 ounces of meat, you get 1 gram of trans fats. So leaner is better. If you get less fat in your meats, you'll have less exposure to trans fats. I was shocked to see Oreo, that wonderful creamy center, must just been straight shortening, because it's down there as 0.53 for an Oreo cookie, and that was a serving of 1. And it just gives you a little idea. You look at even your labels and your mayonnaise and things like that. Okay, so it's read labels, read labels. So you're looking for that word hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, and and now on the food information label, they'll have to label the trans fats just like they do saturated in cholesterol. Now, okay, stores do not have to remove any products from their shelves that were packaged prior to these rules and aren't labeled with trans fats. So again, you just have to refer to your ingredient list on the food to make sure you're not getting any trans fats. And again, they don't. If there's just a little bit, they don't have to say it has trans fats. and I've picked up some things that said no trans fats, and I was surprised. I flipped it over, and like the 3rd or 4th ingredient was partially hydrogenated fats. But it was a small amount, so they don't have to label it. But frankly, I was offended, so I put it back on the shelf. And if they're not making any kind of claims, they can scoot by that one. Okay, guess who else is exempt? Fast foods, where we get tons of our trans fats. And watch out. I mean, they don't have to say that they've got trans fats in there. When you're in the drive-in window, they don't have to stick their head out and inform you how many trans fats they've just passed you. But also watch out for packaged foods that are fast foods that may say cholesterol-free, like on those jelly beans, or cooked in vegetable oil. Well, it could be cooked in vegetable oil, but it might have been hydrogenated vegetable oil. So that's, don't fall for that one. Okay, so how could we start? How do we get these trans fats in our diet? You might want to look at this little list on the back. Again, it had French fries up there as with the trans fats. The butter had nothing. The margarine had 3. The tub had less. And then there's your mayo. That was just that one wasn't hydrogenated. There's your shortening, your chips. The milk was okay. Donuts. Hey, okay. So if you started your day with a donut, this says you could get 5 grams. The other source said 3.2, so it depends on your donut. And then you have French fries for lunch. Okay, so you've already gone over 10 grams of trans fat, and you haven't even made it to the afternoon if you are. And remember, as little as 5 grams of trans fat a day raises your risk for heart disease by 25%. So just put that donut back. Okay, so what am I going to eat now? Well, guess what? Whole foods, whole foods, whole foods. We talk about this a lot. It's kind of like that realtor saying, location, location, location. You can't go wrong with whole foods for the most part. So where do we get good fats from whole foods? Well, we get them from our nuts. They're high in the monounsaturates and our nut butters, as long as you get the ones that aren't partially hydrogenated. And this is, again, it's going to get you to reading your labels. The nut butters traditionally have been sweetened, and they've had partially hydrogenated fats added to them. And that is so that they would have that nice creamy texture we all love. When you buy a natural peanut butter, the oil is all floated up on the top because it hasn't had that extra fat added. So we're talking about natural nut butters here. Seeds are a good source of healthy fats, and particular seed butter, tahini, is sesame seeds all mashed up. Avocados are good. Olive, if you want that wonderful olive oil fat, actually eat the olive. You get fiber and a lot of other things too. And if you use low-fat cheese, sour cream or cottage cheese, you can use those things like for salad dressings and stuff like that if you want to replace some of the oils and fats. If you're going to do beef and dairy, you might want to try the lower fat versions. And then this is just another caveat since we're talking about fats. Cold pressed oils are healthier. They have more nutrients. They haven't been heated, which most oils are manufactured with heat. So you have to look on your label or go visit your health food store to get cold pressed oils. Olive oil is cold pressed. That's about the only way they do that. So that's one benefit to, one of the many benefits of just switching to olive oil. And don't forget to refrigerate, especially with summer coming on. Anything that has a high fat content, whether it's your nuts, your olives, your oils, they need to be in the refrigerator, because the healthier the oil, the more unstable it is. And that means it's just going to go rancid faster. And so we just have to be cautious and make a refrigerator space for it. Okay, so ways to avoid your trans fatty acids, reasons to avoid your trans fatty acids, and some of the references and resources I've used are listed here. And I got stuff from the American Heart Association, from the FDA, a lot of good information from the government agencies who are really promoting avoiding trans fats. And if you want to get some more information about reading labels, the FDA has a good website there. So I thank you for your attention and happy label reading.
Okay, can I talk to you?
Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions? We've got microphones coming around. We've got some questions over there.
Looks like they're all over here.
Hello. So if you've been eating a lot of these trans fats and you all of a sudden stop eating them and switch to the good fats, how long does it take to get all this stuff out of your brain and the rest of your body?
Well, you know, Dr. Reardon used to say you would change every molecule in your body over in the space of 6 years. Ron, wasn't that what he used to say? Yeah. Yeah, and actually some tissues are faster metabolized. That was just kind of a global, you know, every cell in your body. But yeah, some tissues are faster metabolizers. And of course, it will depend for every person how much, you know, how many French fries they've been eating in the past.
Yes, good
Perhaps.
afternoon. This Smart Balance is on the market. Is that any better than any other margarine, or is it in the same category?
Margarines have come a long way. If you'll notice, a lot of these tub margarines, they don't have partially hydrogenated fats in them. They're made from oils, and a lot of them have this functional component, which is the plant sterols added into them, which actually help to lower LDL cholesterol. It's that plant version of cholesterol. Yeah, so there's a lot. Again, read your labels. I've found that not only is the most expensive one looks like the healthiest one. So you just always want to be looking for if they sneak in a little partially hydrogenated somewhere on their label.
Okay, I'll check that out. Thank you.
This is just a comment regarding my previous question. I'm a physician. I do work with a lot of kids who smoke marijuana. Marijuana goes to your fat cells.
Yeah, fat
and so
soluble.
perhaps that gives us an example of how long it might take to get rid of this other stuff, because these kids can smoke marijuana, stop, and they can still come up positive on their drug screens 2 or 3 months later. And a lot depends on how obese or not obese they are. The
Yeah.
obese kids can be positive months later when they're locked up and we know they're not getting any more drugs.
Interesting, because, yeah, obesity is a risk factor. So, yeah, you think about replacing all those fats in the brain. Very interesting.
Go ahead.
Okay. Oh, sorry. We're back here.
Yes. I've heard that hydrogenated oil, the molecule is similar to plastic. Is that true?
Well, in that it's not flexible. I think that's what they mean. You know, the picture of the nice looking cis fatty acid versus the stiff trans, it's lost its plasticity, its flexibility. And I think that's what they mean. Yeah.
Are trans fats the same as partially hydrogenated fats?
Correct. Yeah. It's that partial hydrogenation or hydrogenation that creates trans fats out of our nice oils. Yeah.
How about coconut oil and palm kernel oil?
Well, you're going to be seeing more of that on the label now because there are 3 vegetable oils that are fairly solid at room temperature. In general, oils we think of as liquid at room temperature. But the exceptions are coconut oils, pretty saturated, palm kernel, and palm oil. So you're going to see more of those used by the manufacturers because the food manufacturer will be able to get that saturated property that's important for the texture of their baked goods without the trans fats. And from that one researcher who looked at substituting the partially hydrogenated soybean oil margarine with the margarine that was made out of palm kernel oil, the trans fats was so much worse that it seemed like the saturated fats from the natural vegetable fats wasn't anywhere near the risk problem of the trans fats. So we'll be seeing that substitute made. And even though those are the healthier kinds of saturated fats, we still want to remember we want a big portion of our fat intake to be the mono and the polyunsaturated fats.
You said that the trans fats get incorporated into the myelin sheath. Now, would eliminating trans fats have any effect on people with MS then? Would it lessen their symptoms?
Well, they haven't gotten that far in their studies, but you think about if a person has had a high trans fat diet, that membrane is less fluid, more rigid, will they benefit from a high unsaturated fat diet? So I think the jury's still out on that, but it's an interesting thought. Yeah. Let's see, who's got the... Let's see, we got microphones coming that way. Okay, and then right there. Okay.
Okay. I read in a couple of sources that it's better to cook with coconut oil, that the olive oil, when it's heated, it loses stability. Do you know anything about that?
Olive oil doesn't do well at high temperatures. You need to cook at low temperatures with olive oil. It is unstable at actually fairly normal cooking temperatures, but if you're really going to do hot cooking, olive oil is not a good choice. And like I said, you've often noticed it smokes really fast. Well, you're way past the point of return there. But yes, it's unstable at higher temperatures. So we do better with, coconut oil is a more saturated fat, so you can cook at higher temperatures with it. So it would be better for high temperature cooking than olive oil. Yeah. Well, one of the things papers I read said there can be some transformation of that oleic acid from the cis to the trans, which is taking our nice cis flexible fatty acid into that stiff trans. So yes, at high temperatures there is some conversion. Yeah.
I've read lots of things about popcorn that's supposed to be good for you, but nobody ever says if it's bad for you. So I'm trying to pop it in the right type of oil. Are there any drawbacks? I'm an avid popcorn eater.
It's tough being an avid popcorn eater. You'll notice that back here, popcorn, it was right there, along with our chips. And of course, the kind that we get that's already bagged and ready to stick in the microwave, that's got all sorts of those partially hydrogenated fats. It took the food manufacturers a lot of work to get popcorn to pop nicely in the microwave. So I guess probably some of the healthiest way to do it, and I'm not sure you should quote me on this, is air popping it and putting butter on it. Because popcorn has to be popped at high temperatures. I mean, if you really want to get it to pop. So you've got to be very careful that you're not overheating your vegetable oils. And I know when I was popping it, I'd always wait for a few test kernels to pop. And by that time, things were beginning to really get hot. So I was heating oils high temperature fast, and that's probably not the best thing. So you have my permission to put butter on your air-popped popcorn. Holds the salt better.
Oh, okay. One more question.
Okay, yeah, and then we'll draw for a name, and I'll be here to answer more
We just
questions.
mentioned butter, but where does canola oil?
Canola oil is a vegetable oil. It's actually from the plant called the rapeseed. That's why they call it canola oil, because nobody wants to say rapeseed oil. And if you've ever been in Scandinavia, I'm not making this up. In Scandinavia or Northern Europe, about May, the rapeseed fields are just gorgeous. It's a yellow flower, and they cultivate it, obviously for canola oil. And it's a gorgeous plant, but it's vegetable oil, and it's one of our monounsaturates. But it is usually heat pressed to get from the canola to the oil. And best of all possible worlds, if you can eat cold pressed oils, you're a little bit better off. Less oxidation there.
The preceding program was presented by the Center for the Improvement of Human Functioning International and the Bright Spot for Health Lunch and Lecture Series. To inquire about additional health-related information available on DVD, audio CD, VHS, or audio cassette, simply call 316-682-3100 or drop by 3100 North Hillside in Wichita, Kansas. To discover more about the center and what we have to offer, be sure and visit us on the web at www.brightspot.org.